Everyone, the Federal Reserve is now doing what's called monetizing the debt for the U.S. government. Monetizing the debt is where the Federal Reserve steps in and buys U.S. government debt straight up without even bothering to go through a bank or an investment bank or something like that. What normally happens is the Federal Reserve, if they want to manipulate interest rates, they buy or sell government debt in the open market from companies like Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan or whoever. But I've been saying for a long time, look, at some point the U.S. government's going to want people to buy their debt, and people are not going to be willing to buy their debt. So slowly over the last decade or so, countries have been dropping out. So Japan and China and other countries that have historically owned a lot of U.S. government debt, meaning they've loaned the U.S. government a lot of money, those countries are starting to drop out, meaning they are, paring back and saying, hey, instead of buying additional new government debt and sort of ramping up how much government debt we own, we're going to slowly pare that back. And part of the way they do that is they just start buying less and less, and then as the debt they already own comes to maturity, they just take the proceeds, and rather than sell the debt, they take the proceeds and just, sit on them or convert them back to their local currency or whatever it is they decide to do. So as of the last week or two, the Federal Reserve, there's been a couple, one or more, I can't remember how many, one or more failed treasury auctions. So what is a failed treasury auction? Well, that is when the government says, hey, we're going to auction off, $20 billion of, 5-year government debt and another $30 billion of 10-year government debt and whatever, $40 billion of, 30-year government debt. And of course, each different duration has a different interest rate. So those interest rates have been creeping up. The government is trying to push them down because they have to refinance about $9 trillion this year, which is absolutely insane. About one quarter of all of the U.S. government debt comes due this year, which means they have to, because they're not going to cut back spending. Clearly, there's zero appetite in Washington, D.C. to cut spending, even after Elon Musk and all the Doge, finding of all the waste and fraud and abuse and all that sort of stuff. They're not cutting any of that. The so-called big beautiful bill in Washington D.C., which is a load of crap, is not a big beautiful bill. It's a continuation of every stupid thing the government has ever done, and then it adds more spending. I mean, it's absolutely insane that Republicans have zero appetite to cut the deficit, cut the debt, balance the budget. Like nobody, they act like it's all free money. It's just, I mean, it's free money. So why would you bother? Why would you bother balancing your budget? They act like the debt doesn't matter. It's ridiculous. Well, anyway, the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, who does the bond issuances, they had announced that they were going to auction off a certain amount of U.S. government debt, and the problem is that there were not enough buyers. And there were not enough buyers because too many people had decided that the U.S. government was now not a great credit risk. You know, obviously, I don't know why it took them so long. But, I mean, it's not that you're not going to get paid off. You're just going to get paid off with printed money out of thin air that's worth less than, the value of the money you gave the government. So, if the government takes your money at a 5% interest rate, and then turns around and prints 7% more money to pay your interest, well, then your money ultimately is going to be worth, 7% less. Then you get your 5% interest, and you're still 2% worse off. Well, that's what's happening. And the only reason they're still getting away with it at all is most people are still just asleep and they're not paying attention and they don't know what's going on and all of that. But anyway, so the Treasury had a failed bond auction, which was they ran out of buyers, and they don't ever want to do that. The Treasury never, never, never wants to announce that they are going to auction off a certain amount of government debt and then have it not enough buyers. So what happens in that situation is the Federal Reserve steps in because they have unlimited money because they are the ones that print money out of thin air. The Federal Reserve steps in and starts bidding uh, for that government debt, and then it buys that government debt straight up onto its own balance sheet. So it would be the equivalent of, let's assume, one of my kids started a lemonade stand. And every time they make, a gallon of lemonade and then they go try to sell it, wherever. And let's assume that usually there is, there's enough buyers, so they sell their gallon of lemonade. They announce they're going to make a gallon of lemonade. They make it. They go sell it. They come back. They've got $20 or whatever, and then eventually they, let's say the lemonade gets watered down, right? That's the equivalent to the U.S. government debt. Nobody wants it because it's becoming less and less quality. So the kids go out and they decide they're going to do half lemonade, half water, or something like that. So they're just going to water it down. And people stop buying the lemonade because it's all watered down. And, but I always notice that somehow they always sell out of lemonade. And so I ask them, well, hey, kids, I know you're sort of, mixing the lemonade with water. Uh, how do you keep selling the entire gallon? And they're like, oh, well, after we sell the first $10, we just use the $10 we got to buy the other $10 of lemonade from ourselves. That way we always sell $20 of lemonade. It's like, okay, like, let's think about this. So you're taking money and then you're basically buying the lemonade from yourself because the market doesn't want your lemonade. And then you say, well, the great thing about our lemonade is there's always enough demand to buy a whole gallon of lemonade. And the truth is, no, there's not. There's enough money to buy half of your lemonade, your watered down lemonade, because enough people like lemonade enough that they're willing to buy, half a gallon of watered down lemonade. But then you run out of buyers and you'd have to, lug the other half gallon back in, back home and, tell me how you failed. But instead, you just use the first $10 to buy the second $10 of lemonade from yourselves. And if that doesn't work, you just take some monopoly money out, to the lemonade stand, and however much money, you can't sell of lemonade, you just use the monopoly money to buy the rest of it from yourself. So that's basically what's happening right now with the U.S. government debt auctions is when the marketplace runs out of real people with real money that want to buy U.S. government debt, the Federal Reserve steps in and just buys it with made up money out of thin air. Now, the Federal Reserve has been doing this the last couple weeks. I mean, tens of billions of dollars. We're not talking small amounts of money here. The Federal Reserve has been buying government debt, which is called monetizing the debt. They've been doing that with tens of billions of dollars, which indicates that people just are not willing to trust the U.S. government anymore. Now, this is not a problem unique to the U.S. government. Bond yields, which is the amount of money the government has to pay for people to buy their long-term debt, are getting higher and higher and higher. So in Japan, which is notorious for having borrowed just ridiculous amounts of money, their debt to GDP is much higher than the United States. In Japan, they've got their interest rate for 30-year and 40-year bonds just hit the highest it's ever been in history as of the last couple days, meaning Japan now has to pay people more interest in order to be willing to buy their debt than they've ever had to pay in the history of Japan. Um, and bond yields around the world are high because, again, it's not unique to the United States. Just people are increasingly concerned that that all governments are not going to be able to pay their debts, and so they're demanding higher and higher interest rates. So where does this go? Well, it just keeps. Yeah, I mean, it keeps going where eventually you get the central bank just starts buying more and more of the debt issuance, and that's how you get hyperinflation. You get hyperinflation because as soon as nobody's buying the debt anymore, the Federal Reserve is buying the debt. So instead of the government being funded partially by taxes, partially by borrowed money, which pulls money out of the economy, and partially by printed money, which is the three ways they fund the federal government. Which is it's ridiculous that tax money, even when they take 40% of all of our money, is still not enough. So the way the government works is they tax as much of of your money off of you as they possibly can get away with, and then they borrow as much money out of the economy as they could possibly get away with. And when that fails, they print the rest of the money just out of thin air. So that's three ways the government gets money, all of which are bad for you. Because when they borrow money out of the economy, it makes it harder for you to borrow money in the economy because you're competing with the government to borrow money. and the government can print money out of thin air. So people are more likely, initially to give money to the government because they're like, well, you know, at least I know I'll get the dollars back. They may not be worth as much, but at least I know I'll give them back because the government can just make them out of thin air. So anyway, things are bad when the government has resorted, increasingly to the third category, which is, hey, nobody even wants our debt anymore. We're just going to make the money up out of thin air. So as of the last couple of weeks, that's been happening more and more with the U.S., the Federal Reserve monetizing the debt by just straight up printing money and buying the debt with it. So why is that inflationary? Well, they're loaning money to, they're buying government debt, which is the equivalent of loaning money, and then the U.S. government, which is completely out of control with their spending, no discipline whatsoever, they go spend that into the economy. So as the U.S. government dumps money into the economy by spending and spending and spending and spending, that those dollars are then increasing the money supply, which means there are more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services, which means the price of those goods and services goes up. So now you're competing with the government not just to borrow money, you're also competing with the government to just buy stuff. Because everything you want to buy, someone in the government wants to buy, and they're buying it with made up money, and you're buying it with money you worked hard for. And so it's harder and harder to buy the things you want to afford because you're having to compete with people who didn't do any work to create the money that they're using. Their money was made up out of thin air. Yours, you had to work for, but both of those dollars are now chasing the things you want to buy. So the things you want to buy, the prices of what you want to buy are now going up because of supply and demand. Now, you may not notice that in the near term, but long term you will, because when money is printed out of thin air, it always eventually shows up as inflation. Sometimes there's a time lag. Usually there's like a 12 or 18-month time lag, because that's how long it takes for the money to sort of filter through the economy and to start bidding up prices. Anyway, all of that is bad news for governments, and all of that is bad news for you unless you have Bitcoin. If you have Bitcoin, at some point you can sit in a Zen state and not worry about the fact that a bunch of people are doing stupid stuff. That Washington, is going to pass or has passed, I don't know, this big, beautiful bill, which is garbage, that is full of just ridiculous spending. It doesn't make any spending cuts and it spends way more money. So not only are they not cutting anything that Doge found, they're adding more money on top of it, which is just absolutely insane, absolutely ridiculous. So at some point, if you got Bitcoin, you can sit back in a Zen state and say, well, they're screwing everybody, but they're not screwing me, because they're printing money that everyone else is using, but I'm using money that they can't print more of. So as they print more money, the value of my money goes up because more people switch from the money that's getting printed out of thin air to the money that cannot be printed out of thin air. So monetizing the debt is, typically something governments do in the late stage of their life, as in it's something they do when a government is in decline because they've gotten so profligate, so fat, so dumb, so happy that, they just don't have any discipline whatsoever at all left anymore. And we have clearly arrived at that place in Washington, D.C. So they are monetizing the debt. The Federal Reserve is straight up printing money out of thin air and buying government debt with it. And that's a very bad sign. And the same is happening in other countries because the debt is, the bond, the price of money that the government borrows is going up, is really, really high in all countries right now, which tells you all countries are in a bad way with fewer people trusting them. And that is part of the reason Bitcoin's sitting at $105,000 per coin, is because more and more of the money has decided that they do not want to buy government debt. And instead, they're going to buy something else. And, a percentage of that's going into Bitcoin. Over time, it will be more and more. So good luck out there. And I'm here for anything you need on any front. As always, thanks, everyone.